Friends, we are speaking today about the protests in in the USA against institutionalized racist bias and brutality by the police. And in the context, we will also be talking about institutionalized biases and brutality by the police in India as well. And I just did a Facebook Live in Hindi, and from the Cpiml page, we are again doing a Facebook Live, this time in English. And as some of you may know, quite recently, an African American person called George Floyd, he was detained by the police on a street on some flimsy pretext and forced down on the ground on his front, while one white policeman held his knee on his neck. George Floyd kept saying that I can't breathe, please let your knee up because I can't breathe. But the policeman did not let his knee up until George Floyd was dead. And in fact, not until a few minutes after George Floyd stopped breathing. And meanwhile, there were several passers-by on the street who took videos, who called out to the police people saying, "You are killing this man, he can't breathe, and you are clearly choking him." And yet, the policeman didn't listen and didn't change, and George Floyd lost his life. Nor was this the first incident of its kind, because this is one in a long series of such incidents where the police have used such force against absolutely innocent black persons who are simply going about their daily lives, driving cars or walking on the street and so on. And even when the police are not the ones who have done the shooting or done the killing, when white supremacists have done the killings, they have tended to be let scot-free by the judicial system because of institutionalized racist biases there. Such killings keep happening, and yet no one is punished for them. As a result, there is a huge mass movement ongoing in America right now, in the USA right now, against this kind of police bias and racism. And at the same time, you see that I should remind you that the Black Lives Matter protests go back even long back, even before this, to the Obama administration time as well, when they first started. And at that time also, there were sports stars like Colin Kaepernick in the US who were taking a knee during the playing of the national anthem before a match. They would take a knee in protest as to say that I'm showing respect for the anthem, but I'm also using this occasion to point out that there is institutionalized racism and brutality and murder by the police of my people, of the black people, of black citizens in America. So in spite of there being quite a lot of hate led by now by President Trump against people like Colin Kaepernick and such protesters, in spite of this, the protests are getting a lot of support, including the current protests now. So the US President Donald Trump has of course tried to instigate violence against the protesters. He has tried to say that they are looters, they are thugs, and there should be army deployed against them. And he has baited the governors of various states, saying y'all are weak and y'all are not basically unleashing sufficient violence against the protesters on the street. And all of this is an extremely worrying situation. As you know, COVID-19 is a danger. The protesters are taking care to use masks and to try and maintain distance. But obviously, when the police unleash brutality on them, it is difficult to continue to do that. And the use of tear gas actually puts them more at the risk of COVID-19. It should also be remembered that COVID-19 has disproportionately taken the lives of black people and persons of color, black and Latina communities in the US, just as they have disproportionately taken the lives of Muslims in certain cities in India, because poverty as well as poverty and deprivation tend to overlap with caste and community deprivation and marginalization, both in the US and in India. So here, Dalits and Muslims would tend to be disproportionately among those who are poorer and living in cramped accommodation, and also stigmatized and therefore more reluctant to come forward about COVID-19. The same is the case with the black community in America, and this is another factor right now. So in a way, what we are witnessing right now is not so different. It's not a rupture with the COVID-19 situation. Rather, it is another aspect of the institutionalized, the collapse of extremely unequal and unjust institutions that we are witnessing in the United States of America, in India, and the world over right now. So these protests against racism should be seen in tandem with the COVID-19 situation that we are all undergoing, with the deaths of migrant workers in India, and so on. And at the same time, we should also discuss what's happening in India, because the responses and reactions to what is happening in America by Indians is quite revealing. You have a tweet today by a BJP leader, Kapil Mishra, who was an MLA candidate from the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a openly Islamophobic party that wants India to be declared a Hindu nation. The Bharatiya Janata Party's candidate and leader, Kapil Mishra, is someone who is notorious for having instigated violence against peaceful protesters against India's new citizenship law. Those protesters were, in very large number, they were Muslims, they were Muslim women, but they were also students of all denominations, of all faiths, of all communities, and so on. And Kapil Mishra, in February, at the time when Donald Trump was visiting and being feted by Narendra Modi in India, Kapil Mishra had been instigating violence against those protesters. The protesters at one protest site called Shaheen Bagh in Delhi, at that site, the protesters, all of them women, had basically occupied a part of a public street. And so Kapil Mishra claimed that they were hijacking the streets, and he implied that they were violent and that they needed to be shot dead, or that they were traitors who needed to be shot dead. And he said, if the police is not going to clear the streets, then I'm going to do it. I'm going to make sure that we Hindus do it. Remember that he does not speak for Hindus. So when he's saying those things, did not mean that he was speaking for any particular community. He was only trying to agitate and mobilize Islamophobic Hindu supremacists who were members of his party and his outfit and organization, which he succeeded in doing. So people did actually go and shoot at protesters, and eventually there was violence against Muslim minorities in Northeast Delhi at the very time when Donald Trump was being feted by Narendra Modi in India and in Delhi. Now, Kapil Mishra was not arrested at that time, even though at the Delhi High Court ordered his arrest. In fact, the Delhi High Court judge who ordered his arrest was transferred overnight. The Indian government and the Delhi police, which falls under the Indian government, said it's not the right time to arrest him, and the right time has still not come. Now, that same Kapil Mishra has tweeted today saying, Americans, when the wrong people hijack your streets and set them on fire, then the right people should not remain mute. They should come out in large numbers and be non-violent, but look the wrong people in the eye. Believe me, that's what works. Now, who's Kapil Mishra talking to? Clearly, there aren't very many people who would be listening to him in America. But he is speaking to Indians. He is speaking to his supporters in India. And he is saying here, when he says wrong people, he means African American people are the wrong people, anti-racist protesters are the wrong people in America to be out on the streets. He is asking the right people to come out on the streets. And who does he mean by the right people? He means white supremacists in America. Likewise, in India, he means that the wrong people were the protesters of Shaheen Bagh. The wrong people are the pro-constitution, pro-democracy protesters who were protesting against the unconstitutional citizenship amendment bill that would have made a distinction between, that would have basically turned Muslims into second-class citizens inside India. And that would have been a major step, that is a major step in the direction of turning India into a Hindu nation rather than a secular democracy. So when he says right people and wrong people, Kapil Mishra means that those protesters in India, pro-democracy protesters and Muslims in particular, are the wrong people, and that the right people were those who came out onto the street, which means they rioted, they attacked, they targeted Muslims. But he, of course, says that look, being violent against violent people is not violence. They are the ones who are violent. You are just reacting. And in doing this, he is taking a leaf from the book of his mentor, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who infamously referred to violence against the Muslim minorities in Gujarat when he was Chief Minister. He said that, well, this is a Newtonian reaction to an action, and he falsely claimed that Muslims had been violent against Hindus, and therefore Hindus were justified in killing Muslims. It was merely a reaction against a violent action by the Muslim minorities. This was something Narendra Modi said. This is what Kapil Mishra is implying now in the context of Black Lives Matter, in the context of the protests against George Floyd's killing, and also in the context, of course, of the anti-CA protests in India and the violence by Delhi police against anti-CA protesters. Not only Delhi police, but Indian police in many places. Let me quickly remind you of what these instances were. Whether you are in India or anywhere else in the world and you're listening to us, you should know that one of the defining images of 2020 in India, pre-COVID-19 2020, is going to be the image of the Indian policemen who made Muslim boys lie on the street during the anti-CA protests, beat the heck out of them, and forced them to recite the Indian national anthem, which is a very beautiful, very inclusive poem by the poet Rabindranath Tagore. So they made them recite lines from that poem, basically to and beat them up, and one of those young men has actually died as a result of his injuries. So the police did kill Muslims during those protests and publicly humiliated them. Muslims in those protests were saying, we are not going to show papers to prove that we are Indian. That is not fair to us. We are not going to do that. We are Indian, and you should not question our Indianness and our belonging to this country. By forcing them to sing the national anthem, what the Indian police was doing, what the Delhi police, which falls directly under India's Home Minister Amit Shah, Narendra Modi's right-hand man Amit Shah, what the police was doing was to say, oh no, you are not Indians. You have to prove Indianness, and we will tell you the tests to prove it. It could be documents tomorrow, and today it is that you have to sing the national anthem even with your dying breath. And that's what they did, and no one's been punished for it till now. And nor was that an isolated instance. There were instances of Delhi police standing by while people who had listened to Kapil Mishra, they came and with guns in their hand and shot at unarmed students in the Jamia Millia Islamia University, right? The Delhi police did nothing. The Delhi police did nothing when armed people of the student wing of India's ruling party attacked anti-fascist students, unarmed students and teachers inside Delhi's Jawaharlal Nehru University and tried to kill them. Delhi police did nothing. Delhi police, in fact, escorted those violent armed people, armed mob off the campus. They are yet to arrest even a single one of them. Likewise, you had police in Uttar Pradesh which shot dead protesters, Muslim protesters in the eye. I myself was part of a team that had visited Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh, where the Uttar Pradesh police had stormed into homes, Muslim homes, at random, well-off Muslim homes, and they had beaten people to a pulp inside the homes, and they had broken every stick of furniture, every piece of glass in the house, every mirror in the house, every piece of sanitary fittings in the house. Nothing was left full. And yet no one has been punished for that. No one has been punished for the many killings of unarmed protesters where UP police shot them dead in the back, or shot them when they were sitting on the streets. Not just in Uttar Pradesh, in Karnataka, in Mangalore, Delhi, the police likewise, the Indian police there likewise stormed into even into hospitals and indulged in such violence. Let's not even talk about Kashmir, where this kind of violence has been the norm for a very long time by the police, where massacres of this kind were shooting of unarmed protesters, were shooting of unarmed civilians who were not even protesting, shooting with pellet guns of children, blinding of protesters, blinding of children, you name it. All kinds of atrocities have been the norm. Now, in India, there's a peculiar situation where you have celebrities like Priyanka Chopra, for instance, who's a very well-known actor who has done work in America as well. Now, she tweets about Black Lives Matter and in support of the protests for George Floyd, justice for George Floyd. She tweets and she writes on Instagram in support of those protests. But as an Indian citizen, she meets Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is well known for his openly Islamophobic views. She meets with him and gets photographed with him. She refuses to raise her voice in support of the anti-CAA protesters here. She refuses to raise her voice against police brutalities here and killings by the police, institutionalized killings by the police here. Why should that matter? Who is Priyanka Chopra, you may ask? Of course, she is not an elected official and so on. But the point is, I'm just saying that because I'm saying that as Indian citizens, we should not have double standards. If you are thinking that the right thing to do, that the public opinion in America, where part of your work lies, where it makes it expected of you to speak out in support of Black Lives Matter, then ask yourself why you think that it is okay to do so where you think you're playing to a gallery, and you must do that in America. But since that gallery you imagine doesn't exist here, doesn't hold that kind of clout here, you are trying to appease a different crowd here. You don't want the Narendra Modi trolls supporting trolls on your back here. You don't want to be called an anti-national by the likes of Kapil Mishra. You don't want to be called a traitor by the likes of Kapil Mishra. And that is why you are not speaking up here. So basically, where's your courage? I would say that the most courageous people in America today are those people who are using their position, whether it is just as an American citizen or their status as people who are celebrities or people who are well-known persons, who are actors or who are sports people, to amplify the protests, because they are recognizing that protests are an integral part of a democracy. They are recognizing what Frederick Douglass said, that if you are saying that you want justice but you don't want the protests, that is like saying that you want water but you don't want the rain. That is like saying that you want waves but you don't want the ocean, and so on and so forth. That's exactly what we are saying, what Indians like that are saying today. That's why we need to ask them very politely, of course, that it's time for you to speak up. We expect Americans, Indians of course everywhere, as well as Americans of Indian origin. If you are the kind who and we respect your work, if you are a chef or if you are a stand-up comedian who are speaking about yourself as a desi, if you're telling people that chai tea is not a thing and tea is a thing, if you are basically publicly owning up to your identity as somebody of Indian origin, somebody of South Asian origin, then surely you are expected to draw the connections, to connect the dots between institutionalized racism and police brutality in America, against which you are very boldly speaking, and that's very welcome, and the same institutionalized police brutality and violence that is happening in India by India's police and India's armed forces as well. It is, of course, against Muslims, and not that, of course, in the last 6 years, such violence by India's police has become more shameless. It has become more on your face because they know that the regime right now is unashamed about it and is quite open about endorsing such violence and encouraging and instigating such violence. But let's remember that this is not a new thing. Please search, for instance, for the Hashimpura massacre, where the Uttar Pradesh police picked up unarmed Muslim boys from Muslim young people from a locality called Hashimpura in Meerut, picked them up, took them away, marched them off, and shot them all dead in cold blood and threw their bodies in a drain into a river. So this happened. None of the perpetrators of that massacre have been punished till now. So, and that was not an isolated instance. There are many other such instances of the same kind as well, where police have been involved in the violence against minority communities, especially against Muslim minorities, and not just against religious minorities and people of faith, but against Dalits, who are the most oppressed caste communities in India, as well as against Adivasis, who are India's it's a word that loosely, not exactly, translates to indigenous persons. Basically, these are tribes in India, but who have faced stigma for a very long time, since colonial times, by the colonial police, and now by the Indian police and Indian armed forces as well. So you have many instances of Indian police firing indiscriminately at unarmed Dalit protesters. The Arwal massacre, for instance, in Bihar, at unarmed Adivasi protesters, even not even protesters, people celebrating their harvest festival in Bastar in Chhattisgarh. And the whole thing would be branded as an encounter with armed Maoists later, completely falsely so. And even when it is found to be false, and when the police officers are found to be guilty, they are not brought to trial, they are not punished. There is not a single instance of punishment for such police officers. Likewise, against Adivasi protesters for land and forests and waters and so on in Orissa, in Jharkhand, the exact same thing. Police massacres, police brutalities have happened. Police tortures, Indian jails are disproportionately full of people from poor communities, people from Dalit communities, people from Adivasi communities, and people from Muslim communities. And all these overlap. Dalit, Muslim, and Adivasi communities tend to be poorer in India. There is a whole report called the Sacha Committee report, which comments on the likelihood of Muslim communities being more vulnerable and poorer in India. And which is why your jails are disproportionately full of these people from these communities and backgrounds. Not because these communities have a greater propensity to being criminal, but because whoever commits the crime, irrespective, the police tend to go arrest people from these communities, torture them, because torture is rampant and is considered the norm in the Indian police. There is hardly any Indian police station where torture does not happen, but torture has never happened. And they torture people into to extract a confession, and then they bung them in jail. It may be that years later these people are found innocent, and the police may even be rapped on the knuckles by the courts, who say, well, you arrested and extorted a false confession from these innocent people. But no action has ever yet been taken against the police. No police person guilty of such crimes, such rampant crimes, has ever been punished, and has ever faced the full force of the law as punishment, let me put it that way. And so what does that mean? There are also instances where, of course, there's violence by Islamophobic mobs, or by anti-Dalit mobs, or anti-Dalit private armies like the Ranveer Sena, which is notorious for massacring Dalit landless poor in Bihar, at Bathani Tola, at Lakshmanpur Bathi, because these Dalit landless poor had decided enough was enough. They were not going to put up with being used as slave labor, and they were demanding wages, they were demanding land, they were demanding the right to unionize, and they were demanding the right to vote, and they were voting and electing people of the left party, the Cpiml, on whose page you are now seeing this live video. And to teach those communities a lesson, to teach those persons a lesson, the Ranveer Sena, which was a private militia, of a feudal private militia, backed by the Bharatiya Janata Party leaders and other upper caste leaders from other parties, that outfit had conducted these massacres. Now, the head of that Ranveer Sena was someone called Brahmeshwar Singh, who, in an interview to the New York Times, not long before his death, he was shot dead by unknown persons. So not long before that, before his death, he had spoken to, I think it was Dan Morrison of the New York Times, and he had said, while violence in the pursuit of justice is okay, so violence in the pursuit of peace is okay. And what did he mean by peace? He meant that the Dalits who were asserting themselves to demand dignity and demand equality and demand the right to vote were the ones who were disturbing the peace. They were the ones who were disturbing order, because order was a violent order. So to defend the violent order, violence is okay, because those who disrupt the violent order, even with peaceful protest, they are the violent ones. That's what Brahmeshwar Singh was saying. And you just today, a minister from Modi's cabinet, who is MP from the ruling BJP, Giriraj Singh, he has tweeted, I think it was today or yesterday, referring to the same Rameshwar Singh as a martyr and expressing great admiration for him. Ranveer Sena, remember, was a banned terrorist organization and still is. And how come, you should ask yourself, why is it that members of Modi's cabinet and members of his party, leaders of his party, are tweeting support for white supremacists, are tweeting support for Islamophobic and anti-Dalit terrorists, and for terrorist or leaders of terrorist organizations? The answer lies in India's political reality today, and what India's ruling party today stands for. I'll just end here by saying that we should all be supporting Black Lives Matter. We should all be demanding justice for George Floyd, and we should all be saying that never again should the police of any country be able to violate rights in this fashion, violate humanity in this fashion, and kill persons based on the color of their skin or the clothes that they are wearing. When I say clothes that they're wearing, let me remind you once again that when the anti-CA protests were happening, then Narendra Modi had referred to the protesters as Muslims. He had not used the word Muslim. He had said, you can recognize who they are by the clothes they are wearing. What did he mean? Of course, there were Hindu protesters as well. But what he meant was that because there were many of those protesters who were wearing skull caps and wearing the hijab or the burqa, he was saying that recognize them. It's just the Muslims who are protesting, and they are subhuman anyway. Our CAA, our Home Minister, refers to them as termites. That's exactly what he meant. That is what connects Narendra Modi to and Amit Shah to Kapil Mishra and to Giriraj Singh. And that is why you have to ask yourself that if there are Indian celebrities who are speaking up in America on the right side of history, then why is it that they are so firmly on the wrong side of history here? Why are they getting themselves photographed with Narendra Modi here? Why are they silent against fascists in India here? And against institutionalized police brutality and violence here, against the fact that the police right now in India is arresting the victims of the Islamophobic violence and the anti-CA, pro-democracy protesters, while allowing those like Kapil Mishra who instigated the violence to go free. Why are activists in India today being picked up and put inside jails where they are exposed to COVID-19, even if they are elderly, even if they are pregnant? Why is that happening? That question needs to be asked. And if you're not asking that question, if someone you know is not asking that question but is vocal on Black Lives Matter, ask them why. Because Kapil Mishra at least is making no bones about the fact that he supports the KKK there, he supports white supremacists in America, and he supports Islamophobic violence here. But for those who are talking a liberal talk when it comes to America, ask them why they're not walking that talk here in India. One more thing which I missed out in the Hindi live video, but which I will speak here, is that there is another thing that connects institutionalized police brutality and racism in India and in the US. And that connecting thread is Israeli training. You have multiple instances to which Black Lives Matter protesters have been pointing out in the US of the fact that policing has become more and more militarized because the police in the US is being trained by and given equipment by Israeli forces, which are using the same template that they do to maintain the occupation of Palestine and to maintain their racist apartheid against the Palestinian people. Likewise, in India, you have police in India, you have reports that police in India are receiving equipment and training from Israel, which they have of course been using in Kashmir and will also and have also begun using in other parts of in various parts of India as well. And that is something including facial recognition technology and other kinds of technologies, as well as policing weapons and so on, which are being used against protesters. And this puts in danger civilian protesters, ordinary protesters. It dubs the very act of protest, which is an act which is the marker of democracy. America is a democracy because people are protesting. India is a democracy only so long as people protest. And yet you have President of America and the Prime Minister of India and members of his cabinet and his home minister here in India being openly hostile to protesters, referring to protesters as members of the ruling parties there and here, referring to protesters as the, who are demanding peace and justice as the real perpetrators of violence. One last thing I'd like to say is that remember the words of Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in America to become become an activist for abolition of slavery. Frederick Douglass, he famously said that those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation, those who say we want freedom, but we don't want slavery, but we don't want agitation. They are people who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. And that is what we need to remember in India today as well. That this is true, of course, for America, but in India as well. This goes for even not only for the right wing, rabid right wing in India who are all for shooting and killing protesters and so on, but even for the liberal commentators in India, many of them who are well-meaning, with whom I don't think we should see them as enemies. We should not, stamp labels on their heads. But I will ask them, in the spirit of friendship, in the spirit of learning, that maybe you should read Frederick Douglass. Maybe you should ask yourself why you want protests in India to be absolutely pristine and perfect. Why you say, oh, a bus was burnt, and so the protesters have completely lost legitimacy. If you are a liberal star anchor, and you're saying that kind of thing, watch out. Ask yourself, whether you would whether who is saying the same things in America right now. If people in America are saying, I saw somebody today tell people in America that if you're saying, it's sad that a black man was killed by the police, but looting shops and burning police vans or police stations is wrong, then ask yourself instead, why are you not saying that looting shops or burning a police station is sad, but the shooting of black people and killing of black people, murder of black people by the police is wrong? So change your priorities a little bit. Likewise, in India, say that, for one thing, in most of the cases, protesters didn't burn the buses. But if you are among those who are saying, protesters threw a stone, protesters burnt a bus. For instance, in Kashmir, you say, protesters throw stones, where they do in fact throw stones. Then ask yourself, should you not be saying, instead of saying, it is sad that, Kashmiris are being shot at with pellet guns and killed, but they shouldn't throw stones. Maybe you should switch that. You should invert that. You should say, it is sad perhaps that stones are being thrown. It is sad perhaps that some protesters burnt a bus somewhere in Delhi or somewhere in UP. But the police shouldn't be killing human beings. They shouldn't be killing unarmed protesters. They shouldn't be killing unarmed bystanders. They shouldn't be killing people based on their faith. They shouldn't be forcing a person whom they are beating to death, a Muslim boy they're beating to death, to sing India's national anthem. They shouldn't be insulting India's national anthem like that. That is what we need to say. And that is what we need to hear a lot more of. So if you are in India, if you are an Indian citizen, of course, but if you are of Indian origin anywhere in the world, we expect to hear you speak up. Also, we expect to hear you speak up, especially if you are an Indian sports star, an Indian actor, not because we hold you in such high regard or we give you that power, but simply because you should do it for your own good. You should do it to show that you really belong in the citizenship of a democracy. You should do it to show that you're not a hypocrite. You should be doing that as an act of contribution, a real contribution towards keeping India democratic, towards ensuring that India doesn't become a police state. Thank you very much.